My name is Peter Höyng, and I'm the chair of the German Studies Department here at Emory University. And it's a true pleasure to welcome you all to this wonderful evening and discussion that we are going to have with two of my colleagues. And the way we will proceed is that I will briefly introduce each one of them, and then there will be interlocutors on fairy tales and beyond in German and Yiddish. And after that, we will have time for approximately 25 minutes or so for question and answers. So first I will introduce my colleague, Miriam Udel. She's Associate Professor of Yiddish, Language, Literature, and Culture. Her expertise is the Jewish encounter of modernity, and she received her PhD from Harvard University. And as of this week, and as you can see with the backdrop of her home, we are celebrating big. There it is. It just came out on Tuesday, her latest book, Honey on the Page, with NYU Press. And in it, she delivers or provides nearly 50 stories and poems from around the globe in Yiddish, and most of them appear for the very first time in English in her translation. And basically, this anthology is the first comprehensive children's literature of Yiddish in English available. Prior to that, she published her first monograph with a wonderful title, Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picaresque, and that appeared with University of Michigan Press. For that, she received the National Jewish Book Award for Jewish Thought. And she's currently working on a critical study of Yiddish children's literature that will serve as a companion to the book Honey on the Page. And she couldn't have found a better interlocutor than our dear colleague, Jack Zipes. He's Professor of Emeritus of German, Comparative Literature, and Cultural Studies. And if you hear vaguely the term emeritus, you think, oh, sorry. Could you hear me prior to it?
We could, yeah.
Okay, good, okay. So if you get the idea that emeritus sounds like that he's sitting on the swing in the Midwest and twiddling his thumbs, you're sorely mistaken, because he keeps on just being busy. And I'll tell you in a brief moment why and with what. His focus over the last few decades has been of obviously German literature, but also German Jewish culture and the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. And above all, and the reason why he's here with us tonight, with children's literature, and in particular fairy tales. And it is basically a new area where you see scholarly output in the public arena. And I'm not going to list you the 24 or so single monographs that he published, and I'm also not going into the 20-something edited volumes that he published. I rather highlight those elements that are relevant for our discussion tonight. While he was teaching at the University of Minnesota, he founded and directed Neighborhood Bridges at the Children's Theater Company, a national and internationally acclaimed storytelling program for children. And he did that nearly for 20 years. And more impressive, if I might say so, even at least for us in the field, is that he translated the entire complete fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm into English. And when he retired about a decade ago, he established a major series for literary fairy tales with Princeton University Press called the Oddly Modern Fairy Tales. And 2 years ago, he founded a publishing house with a wonderful title, Little Mole and Honey Bear, which publishes unusual children's books from 1910 to 1940. And as we hear from the title of that publishing house, The Honey Bear, and having honey on the page, it was a match that had to happen. And tonight we will listen to Miriam and Jack to discuss the book in the larger context of German fairy tales and children's literature in Yiddish. And before we start, the last thing that I want to do is to give a special recognition to the Hightower Funds and to the TAM Institute of Jewish Studies here at Emory University, who helped funding this evening. Miriam and Jack, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much, Peter. This has been really quite a thrilling day. My students, many of whom are here with us this evening, had the good fortune to have a visit from Professor Zipes during our first year seminar on children's literature and the quest for just societies. So we were able to start unpacking some of the themes, but I think that just from their questions, and of course, from my own deep engagement with Professor Zipes' work, there's a lot more that remains to be discussed. So first, I wanted to start us off just thinking about the comparison and the contrast between the German and the Yiddish fairy tale traditions. So I know that Professor Zipes got to read pretty widely in Honey on the Page because he was kind enough to provide the foreword. And I'm just wondering, as you read some of the stories that were more fairy tale-like, did anything strike you for its similarity or for its difference to the Brothers Grimm and to the larger German fairy tale tradition?
Yeah, you know, I've been thinking about that a great deal, and it really would involve a very long and complex study because of the fact that when when we talk about the German tradition in folklore, the different areas before the unification of Germany in the 19th century, that many of the collections were in different dialects, and a lot of the collections are stamped, say, by Bavaria or Prussian or Swabia, depending on where you come from. So it's really quite difficult to talk about, in quotes, a German, let us say, tradition, because the traditions were also based on the rituals and the belief systems in particular areas of Germany. So I'd like to sort of step back from that a little and say that there are a few things that are clear, let's say, in the broader German tradition. If you think about, say, the Grimm's collection, bringing a lot of tales from different areas, and essentially, one of the things that is notable, say, in the Grimm's tales is that they tend to be much more, let us say, serious and involved, and they tend to involve resolution, some sort of resolution, not a happy end necessarily, but a resolution and very strong but brutal, let us say, endings with regard to social justice. That is, if somebody has committed a crime, that person will probably have their heads lopped off, or they'll be hung, or something like that. So they tend to be, the tales tend to be stamped, I think, by a peasant. And when I say peasant, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but these are tales, the 19th century folk tales, and I differentiate between literary fairy tales and oral folk tales, that the collections that were eventually published by educated people who either knew the dialects, they uh, quite often uh, use these tales in somewhat of a secular pedagogical way, and that you can discern certain laws that the characters obeyed and or didn't obey by, but they also there is a sense that the peasants were generally mistreated or maltreated, and you get it, and that these tales do reflect a very patriarchal way and a severe sort of set of rules that if you didn't oblige, then somehow, either through magic or through the behavior of the particular characters, you might not, you might be punished severely. So, but with regard to what I do know of the Yiddish literature in the 19th century, and this is mainly for adults and throughout into the 20th century, there is a sort of, first of all, less optimistic view in a lot that there is a Jewish ironic black humor, what we call sort of a humor that is very ironic, and that for the most part, there are going to be strange happenings that are that are strange because of the fact that a lot of the times you get the schlemiel or the fools that turned out to be actually very wise and unusual characters that you don't get. Let me put it this way: there's more humor, but it's a different. It's not your broad humor that you might find. You don't really find that in the German tradition of the 19th century. But what you do get in most of the Yiddish tales is a sense that we may be doomed, but we're going to have a good time while we're being doomed or while we're outcasts. You also get a sense that the characters can be very scurrilous. And then finally, another aspect of the Yiddish tales is cynicism. One of the tales that I recently read, there's a wonderful, anybody interested in the history of Yiddish literature should read Leo Wiener's book, The History of Yiddish Literature in the 19th Century, which is really a superb book. And in it, he has a tale that a woman tells. It's called Das Jüdische Kind, the Jewish child, in which the child is pictured as a worm, and a worm crawling, and who despite managing to survive all different things, the outlook is just doom. The worm is doomed, and this is a tale that was told to children about children in the 19th century, and you do get a certain gloom, doom, irony, humor, black humor, dark humor, whatever you want to call it, and so that I think stamps the Jewish, both the Yiddish and the German Jewish literature in the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century.
So I think one of the things that's exciting as we move into the 20th century and get to the 20s and 30s is that for the children's literature, at least, Yiddish kind of moves away from that sort of lachrymose account of the world. And because so much of Yiddish children's literature is an outgrowth of a Yiddish cultural nationalist project and a sense of a a
Right.
Yiddish national revival,
Yes.
they start telling hopeful stories. They actually
Yes.
want kids to believe that you can grow up, and if you're a virtuous person, you can have a happy life,
Yes.
right? And if you
Yes.
embrace the right sorts of ideological commitments, then things could actually maybe go well.
Yes.
So there's a little more sunshine that does
Oh,
come into it.
a, a
Yeah,
lot more. I would say a lot more because what happens, of course, after the unification of Germany in I keep forgetting the dates, 1870, I think. After that, you have the Jewish you have not only an enlightenment according to, say, Jürgen Habermas in his book on the public sphere and so on, but you get an opening. The Jews from the period from about, let us say, 1870 to Hitler's rise to power in 1933, enjoyed a, a, let us say, a, an education, a freedom that they never suspected they would have. And this is a period when schools were organized so to teach both, well, just to teach all types of languages, but sort of Jewish laws, Jewish customs, and so on. Most of the Jews in the 19th century couldn't read or write, and but in that period, toward the end of the 19th century, that changed, and that, of course, stamped the literature for young people, okay, and also for older people as well. So there is a marked difference between the Yiddish stories that you get in the 19th century, say, before the Enlightenment, and once the Enlightenment hits, it's there's an extraordinary, I would say, flowering of Yiddish, a flowering of magazines, newspapers, schools, groups are being formed. And this is also true of the German public in general. I mean, you have, Germany was the foremost country at the beginning of the 20th century, known for its liberalism, known for its great philosophers and intellectuals, some of them or a good many were Jewish, were allowed finally to go, attend the university. So all of this was a really wonderful period, and your book really captures, I think, the way that you've divided into holidays, schools, and it shows also up to the present or a development. Unfortunately, Yiddish did die. It hasn't died yet, but it's not the language it once was, and it's not the language that most Jews speak anymore. But it had that moment, that really wonderful moment at the beginning of the 20th century, and since, unfortunately, since the Holocaust, things have turned, for the language at least, have not turned out that well.
yeah, yeah. I wonder how important you think the question of age stratified reading materials was, meaning so the Grimms, you explained so beautifully in your introduction to the first edition of the Grimm's fairy tales, that the brothers were really engaged in this ethnographic project of collecting oral tales, and they would go, sit in salons with high-class ladies of leisure who had time to sit around and tell stories, but they would also go to peasants' huts, and sort of picturing someone sitting there peeling potatoes and telling some of these stories. And it's really over the course of the 7 editions over almost 50 years that these stories come to be a commodity, and B, a commodity aimed at children. So you talk about how the texts get sanitized, how references to extramarital sex get wiped clean, and that there are references to Christian piety that get inserted within the text in order to make them more appropriate for children. So that means that there's also a kind of burgeoning sense of what it means to have a child reader with a kind of child sensibility. And it strikes me that when we talk about these Yiddish stories that I was looking at, these are all from the age of the literary fairy tale as opposed to the true, you know, bottom up folk tale. How significant do you think that difference is in shaping these?
The difference between the German and the Jewish tradition, or
Yeah, between the literary fairy tales in the 1920s and 30s, and we also have some cognate texts that you write about from Weimar Germany in German, versus the Grimms out there collecting oral tales for listeners of all ages.
Yeah. Again, we could stay here and talk about this for hours. So I'll try to hone in. First of all, the Grimm's collection was never, ever, despite its title, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, it was never intended for children, ever, okay? And it was not until the third edition that Wilhelm, the younger brother, who was given the chore of adding to the collection and finding many other versions, that they began thinking about children. And part of that was also due to the fact that their first edition was translated into English in 1820s with illustrations by the great George Cruikshank. And so the book became a bestseller. The first two editions of the Brothers Grimm were flops, and the publisher was really somewhat irritated by the Grimms, because they were really not. The books, they were heavy footnotes. These were for scholars, the first 2 to 3 editions. And in fact, I would even argue and say that at least the German editions up through the 7th edition, that most of they never intended, and they didn't care to a certain extent about the sensibilities of children, because the tales really also, we have to remember that the sensibilities of peasant children or lower class children were not at that time like the middle class or the bourgeois children. Children's literature really had not established itself, or doesn't really establish itself until the golden age. I'm talking about Europe, and even America, until about the 1880s or 1890s. And that for the most part, the sharing of these tales, there were no barriers. And the children, we have to remember, the most families, particularly the peasant families and the lower class, working class families, they lived in one-room apartments or huts. And when they told tales at night, the children were there, and they didn't really care about what the children heard, because they all enjoyed these tales that they gathered. So with regard to, and I think that was also true with the Yiddish, in the Yiddish tradition. I'm not the expert that you are, but my guess is that these tales, that the sort of darker tales and so on, were also told with young people present, and they would laugh or scare the children or whatever. And that this type of the precocity of children, the sensitivity of children, is still exaggerated and dumb, okay? Because in all my work with children is children know much more stories than I do when I go in and do sessions with them. They know how to curse better than I do. And so we have to stop this myth about we're going to traumatize our children if we use curse words or if we do this. And I mean, there's so much hypocrisy in the way we treat children. It's ridiculous. So, so basically, as the literary fairy tales developed, they had already developed, began developing, you know, with the Italians, Basile and Straparola in the 15th and 16th centuries. And the French, of course, were really prominent in the development of the literary fairy tale, tales that were told by, well, actually the women were much stronger, Madame d'Aulnoy and the whole group around the salons, women's salons. So with the literary fairy tale, then really the source of the literary fairy tale are these oral tales, and to some extent maybe the Greco-Roman tales and other, but we don't know completely what all the sources were, but we do know that when more and more people became educated, and when middle classes, universities were developed, schools developed, by the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, begins a flowering of very complex, highly skilled, unusual, philosophically fantastic, imaginative plots. All of these things began developing so that there are, even today, there are still major distinctions between the literary, what I call the literary fairy tale, and say oral tales that we tell. And we do have sort of a very strange, in the last 10 years or so, storytelling has become a commodity, more of a commodity, more of a, is breaking through in mass media with the internet and radio, you name it. And so some interesting things are developing, but I think we have to bear in mind that there's a wonderful dialectic between the oral and the literary.
Yes, so in Yiddish, we do have oral literature, but what we really see around the turn of the 20th century, before this children's literature really takes off, really 1885, so long, long 20th century, we see this trend that's embraced by some of the writers that we regard as die Klassikers, the classic writers of the Yiddish tradition, such as Yud Lamed Peretz, a trend of embracing Volksstimmlichkeit, which is in the folk manner, things that are regarded as folkish, that don't actually come from the ground up, but that are written by, the writer in his garret, but that have that sound and that texture of orality and these kind of demotic people's voices. And that becomes a very popular trend. And that's really what helps to establish, that kind of fuels the rise of the Yiddish novel and of Yiddish fiction. And of course, we see traces of that then in the children's literature, but the texts for children, the ones that I deal with, they're all very much made things as opposed to found things. They're not, found stories. They're very highly composed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also struck at the contrast between the class hierarchy with respect to reading and habits of literary consumption that you mentioned, Jack, as opposed to the major hierarchy and stratification in Yiddish culture and in Eastern European Jewish culture is a habit of gendered reading consumption. so that men are expected to be reading Hebrew and engaging with Holy Writ if they are able, Hebrew and Aramaic as a single linguistic complex, and the materials from which modern Yiddish fiction really springs, those materials are verweiben, verfreuen, for women, the children in women's orbit, and Männer was seinen azoi wie freuen, men who are like women, this is the phrase that was used, insofar as they did not have access to holy texts. And so Yiddish was for, the lower classes, but the lower classes might be, sharing a marital bed with the cultural elites. It's just that the elites were all men and the non-elites were largely women, or men who couldn't sort of rise away from the taint of that women's reading material. And of course, that also carries with it the sense of stigma of a lesser text. And we see that really kind of embodied by the fact that Yiddish has two different words for books, right? We have holy books from the Hebrew-derived term sefer, sforim, and then we have everything else, which are bicher, das Buch, and the plural bicher, right? Which is, it's anything that comes from the secular world, even though there wasn't really such a clear secular sacred distinction yet when we start to see this linguistic distinction between sforim and bicher. So there are such similarities, but there are also these really instructive points of divergence. Well, in our last few minutes before we take questions from the audience, I would love to talk about the role, and this is something we touched on a little bit earlier today, but to just open this up even more widely, the role of children's literature in these traditions in fomenting social change, and how children's literature was used as a tool or was not used as a tool for pursuing social justice in all of its forms.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you want to talk about classical fairy tales or Weimar.
Yeah.
Modernist fairy tales.
I'm sort of interested in I'll answer your question in a second, but I'm also sort of interested in what you have to say about the topic also, as to whether in the 20th century, when children's literature does become politicized, whether Yiddish literature, Yiddish literature for children becomes as political as the tales that the Germans and French and British, and to a certain extent American tales start becoming much more political, and quite often are purposely created for schooling. So let me just answer that, my part, and then maybe you can come back and explain something to me, which would be interesting. So what happens, probably, I would say, in Britain, the first really golden age of children's literature, or the best writers, I would say, yes, I'll use that term, we're actually in England. We're in Ireland, England, and the UK. And there were numerous texts, numerous authors who were influenced to a certain extent, by oral traditions, but essentially, these were writers who were very creative, and a lot of them were women. By the end of you have the Fabian movement, and around the whole Fabian movement in the 1890s in England and in Ireland, and a lot of the Irish tales were told against the British tales. So literature then becomes very politicized, and in Germany, in particular, after the loss of World War I, there was an explosion of communist fairy tales, socialist fairy tales, just sort of green fairy, you name it, it all happened in the Weimar period. And it was a flowering, and tales were used in particular schools to educate children to think along, say, socialist lines or communist lines, or just liberal lines, or religious lines. A lot of religious schools were developed, so that the beginning of the 20th century was, up until that point, I would say that children's literature was read mainly by the upper classes, aristocracy and upper classes in most countries. In most countries, children had not learned, did not know how to read, and so there was really no emphasis placed on reading, and all that changed at the beginning of the 20th century, and you get some of the really masterful in this collection that I did on Weimar tales and fables. These are not simple tales; they're rather complex, rather unusual insofar as that the wordplay, linguistic formations, and so on were not easy to follow, and yet children were exposed to these books. How much they were influenced by them, it's really difficult. They were also, at the same time, a very strong sort of right-wing folk ideology. In other words, there was this notion that you had to read pure German tales, pure folk tales, and so on. And that happened at the same time that there was a lot of political identical theories or lessons that were being spread or disseminated in Germany at that time, and also in other countries. So children's literature, I think, became recognized by a lot of thinkers as a way to get them early, to socialize them as soon as possible, so that they began thinking along the ideological lines that their parents and friends and so on, groups that they belonged to, all of that was extremely crucial up through 1933, and even more crucial in a negative way in Germany, where they burned the books that they didn't want people to read because it might open their minds a little. It's sort of what some of that is going on here in America today, where education is not being valued, except you don't have to go to school anymore. We don't need schools, or we should keep schools only for very well-to-do people who follow certain ideological principles. So that is sort of my response, but I'd be interested to hear how Yiddish was being used with children in terms of socialization.
Sure. So at the beginning of the 20th century, there is an educational reform movement that sweeps through the Jewish world. And so the traditional way that boys in particular, but in some places also girls, were educated was a very informal system, if you could even call it that, called the cheder, which meant room. And it was local and fairly disorganized, and parents would bring their children directly to the home of a melamed, a rabbinical instructor, and at a very young age. It could be as young as 3 or 4. and the child would take his place on the wooden bench next to all the other little boys, trying to get a seat by the stove. That was the best seat. And he would start learning Chumash. He would start learning the fossilized translation of the Pentateuch that was the kind of common entree into text study. It was a very particular way that the 5 books of Moses were translated into the vernacular, into Yiddish, but not into the current spoken Yiddish, into, as I said, something that was a little bit on a higher register, a little bit of a linguistic fossil. And around the turn of the 20th century, it was just economically unsustainable to have kids who started their education that way and progressed into Talmud and Jewish law and didn't learn any science or mathematics or other languages or any of the kind of curriculum that we would consider today to be general studies. So there was a movement called the Cheder Metukan in Hebrew, the reformed Cheder, which in the Yiddish pronunciation was called the Cheder Mesuken. And this is a wonderful interlinguistic pun because if you give it that pronunciation, it becomes a homophone with the word mesuken or mesukan, which means dangerous. So it becomes the dangerous cheder in the viewpoint of its detractors, the traditionalists who wanted to kind of keep things the way they were. And so as a mass movement towards secularization begins, the arena, one of the primary arenas for that change was schools. First, the Cheder Metukan or Cheder Mesuken, and eventually the fully secular, modernized schoolroom that was known as the shule. And so shules were, by and large, they were coeducational, and they had teachers who had received some kind of pedagogical training, and they were established by political parties. So we ended up it was a little bit different in Poland and Russia, but in the United States and New York, we ended up with 4 flavors, 4 separate school networks, secular school networks in Yiddish, corresponding to the following, and I'll try to make this very brief. 1, the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute was what today we would call just Jewish. When people identify as being just Jewish, don't put a label on me. So this was just Yiddish, right? My attachment and my connection to Jewish civilization is through the Yiddish language, and it's not highly politicized, but it's just all about Yiddish. The second was the socialist Zionist model, where we're talking about socialists, we're not talking about religious Zionists, we're talking about leftists, but they believed that the Jewish future lay in creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine, in what they called Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. The third variety was the Bundists, the socialists, who believed in the international brotherhood of workers everywhere. And then a little bit to the left of them were the Verbrennte Kommunisten, the ardent communists, who believed that, yes, we were going to have this international brotherhood of workers everywhere on the Soviet model for the most part. And each of these movements and subgroups had its own school network and eventually its own publishing arm. And so the work that we're seeing in the 20s and 30s is either subtly or explicitly political, but it's always ideological. So it can be something as simple as in the story by Judah Steinberg, a boy realizing that, a relatively well-off kind of bourgeois boy realizing that the carpenter's family has no furniture, but his family does. And the washerwoman who washes the family's clothes is dressed in rags. And the cow that produces milk for him to drink, her own calf doesn't get to drink her milk, and he lows and moos for his mother all day. And there's this whole world order that's all organized so that he can exist in comfort and pleasure. And he realizes that he needs to start examining that, interrogating that. And he goes to ask his mother, you know, why? What's up with this? And his mother says, I don't know. And he says, you know what? I'm going to write this question down. And when I grow up, I'm going to go out and find answers. And I know that we're kind of at our time that we need to, that we want to open up for audience questions. So I think that's a good place to leave things.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Indeed, that's a very good transition, and maybe particularly also to open it up to our students that they have a chance to ask you about this wonderful cross-cultural comparative analysis of Yiddish traditions and the German fairy tales. One thing I learned, of course, is by Jack is that Miriam is much smarter than the Grimm brothers, because she first publishes the popular translation and then delivers a scholarly work, and not like them, you know. So hopefully you will be as successful, Miriam. Anyway, I encourage students to send us questions via the chat. We have about 15-20 minutes, so please go ahead. If no one dares to ask, then let me, oh, Didiam, okay, go ahead. So here comes the first question by Britta from Georgia Tech. How and where did you find the fairy tales? That's actually, Britta, also the question that I had. It's like, how did you start your project, and how did you realize that there's such a rich trove that hasn't made it into the English vernacular?
So the great fortune, or depending on your perspective, scandal of it all, was that it was all just sitting there right in plain sight. It was even digitized. I finished writing my first monograph on the picaresque, and I was casting about for a new project, and I was teaching Yiddish language. And I thought about the fact that when I studied other languages, when I studied German, when I studied Spanish, when I studied Hebrew, we always read some children's literature, and I had never done that in a Yiddish classroom. And I wondered why. Was there any Yiddish children's literature? I had never really heard about any. I knew that there were the Sholem Aleichem stories and that they involved child protagonists, and I had a vague sense that Sholem Aleichem children went together. And I knew, of course, that Isaac Bashevis Singer had published some very popular children's stories in English. Interestingly, none of them are published as books in Yiddish. He went straight to translation and published in English starting in 1965 with his first collection for children. But really, was there anything else? And so I started looking around. It didn't take very long because the Yiddish Book Center had not only digitized hundreds of these books, but they had even commissioned something, a resource that lives on their website called the Noah Kotzen Library, where they assembled a team of 6 volunteers, I think in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, who read through almost 1,000 works of Yiddish children's literature and wrote brief synopses. And so there was this incredible aid to finding material that was going to be good. And I started reading it and I said, well, surely somebody's done something with this, because a lot of it is terrible, but you know, if 10% of it is fantastic, that's 100 stories, right? And really not that much had been done with it. So I started on this project 7 years ago, and it took some time, but that's how I got started.
Wonderful, congratulations. And here are 2 questions coming in. One from Samuel Ingalls, I guess that is particular for Jack, relevant, since you touched on the book burning by Germany, and what effect did that have then to continue the fairy tales under the Nazis? How did they deal with it?
Well, during the book burning, the
After,
pardon?
after the book burning, basically, what did the Nazis then do? Did they have to alter the Fair Grimm's fairy tales, or there was?
Oh no, not at all. But the tales generally were edited or adapted depending on what particular tale might be taught or in a book, and so that the ideological meaning of the book would be slanted toward fascism, toward Nazism, and so that's how they handled that. They also had there was a noted, a remarkable folklorist by the name of I'm forgetting his first name. His last name is Blunk, B-L-U-N-C-K, and he was by the late 1930s. He had a high position in the government, and he published a number of collections of folk tales. There were other areas in Germany where publishing folk tales became sort of the right thing to do. You know, we're publishing only pure folk tales that were spoken in dialect, and so that continued to go on.
Thank you. And we go ahead now with this question from one of our students, and I'll read it out to you, even though you can't see it. What do you find culturally specific about these stories? And I assume, Höyng, you mean basically Yiddish as well as fairy tales, or is your question directed towards Yiddish?
So I'm not sure whether we can hear Höyng, but
Yiddish
he or
culture.
she
Okay.
has posed
Yeah,
a wonderful Yiddish culture. Okay, so I want to start answering this because this is a wonderful question. And I'm going to draw on the sort of two polar ends of the book in order to try to answer it for you. So in general, the book follows a trajectory from the most distinctively and particularistically Jewish material, Jewish holidays, Jewish history, Jewish heroes, and it moves out. It kind of opens toward the more universal as it goes on. So the first story is a Sabbath tale. It is a kind of Yiddish subgenre or Jewish subgenre of the wonder tale. It has a lot of similarities with Russian wonder tales. If we look at the story grammar of Russian wonder tales that's proposed by Vladimir Prop, this hews very closely to a lot of that story grammar, but it is a subgenre that places a heavy emphasis on observing a traditional Jewish Sabbath, the day of rest that comes every Friday night to Saturday night. And what's interesting about these Sabbath tales is that they are being written by secularist leftists who don't observe the Sabbath, who don't expect their children to observe the Sabbath, who are writing for classes and groups of school children whose families also don't observe the Sabbath in the traditional way. But it's a matter of taking their values, which in this case was a socialist value of establishing a time of rest for the worker, when the worker would be free of responsibility to the boss. When, you know, if God owns your time for 24 hours, then the boss doesn't own your time for that 24 hours. So it's a matter of taking their values and finding a way to kind of cloak them in very traditional Jewish imagery and concerns. So that's at one end. And then when we get toward the end of the book, we have just two stories that I've excerpted from a wonderful collection of 12 stories about Labzik, who I call leftist lassie. Labzik is a mutt, a mixed breed dog that gets adopted by a very loving, very idealized family of ardent Jewish communists who live in Brownsville. And Lobzik is the hero of just about every story. And in every story, the children have a kind of socially conscious communist adventure. And so in one of the early stories, the head of the Weimar era Communist Party, Ernst Thälmann, has been imprisoned. And he's the kids' hero, and they want to go out and collect money for his legal defense fund. So the natural thing to do is to go out to the Jackson Avenue elevated station and collect money in a can. But it's not just any can, and it's not the ordinary word for can. The word that the author, Chaver Paver, uses is a pushkin, which everyone knows is the can where you collect charity for the poor, for old school charitable giving. So there's a kind of a Jewish cultural and civilizational twist that comes in even to a secular story about raising money for the non-Jewish head of the German Communist Party.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And I'm aware of time, so I want to close out our discussion with a question, once again, from Britta, which I think is appropriate since it brings the two of you together, the German fairy tale and the Yiddish. And her question is, did you find something of the Grimm or the other so-called German tales in Yiddish, or is there no overlap between these two cultural spheres?
Well, Yiddish in general was absolutely obsessed with translation into Yiddish. Yiddish readers wanted to eat the literary world, I mean, through translation. And so yes, Grimm's tales do make it into Yiddish. Fairy tales make it into Yiddish just because, I mean, Isaac Bashevis Singer translated Knut Hamsun's novel Hunger. Everything made it into Yiddish during a certain period from, say, the 1840s to World War II.
Okay, it's a good sign that there were more questions, but once again, I'm conscious of time, and I'm sure you are also have gone through a number of Zoom meetings today, so we'll leave it at this. But it has been truly wonderful to have Jack with us, and congratulations again, Miriam. And of course, I realize the real drawback of all that Zooming is that we can't have now stay around, be together, have a glass of wine, toast, and have something to eat. So I'll leave it at that. Thank profoundly again, Jack. It has been wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me very much.
Yeah,
and congratulations. Congratulations.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. And Miriam, once again, our congratulations from all of us here. And I want to give also a particular recognition to all the students who joined us tonight from, as far as I understand, around the globe. So thank you, everyone, and we'll hope to see you soon in another on another occasion when we will host another event within the German Studies Department coming soon in October with the Afro-German actress Sherry Hagen. Everybody has a wonderful evening, and again, my special thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, thank you. And I'll stick around for a moment, just if anyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you.
Made it a red letter day.